Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a figure moving through the darkness of the 41st millennium, not one of the chaos gods with their thundering legions and shrieking demonic courts, not a primarch returned from exile with purpose burning in his eyes, not a hive mind bearing down on 1,000 worlds, no single will distributed across 1,000,000,000,000 organisms, just a figure. Cloaked in rumor, armored in secrets, operating beneath the notice of empires and gods alike, and threading through the spaces between every major institution and every major conflict, as though those conflicts were nothing more than weather, temporary conditions to be endured, while the real work continues below the surface. For hundreds of years, was two of the most capable and relentlessly driven inquisitors in the history of the Imperium of man have dedicated the whole of their careers that by any normal measure would count as extraordinary lifetimes of service, to finding this figure. Both of them are brilliant. Both of them have access to networks of agents, psychic talents, and resources that ordinary mortals cannot imagine. Both of them have killed and sacrificed and burned down entire institutions in the pursuit of their respective missions. And still, after all of that effort, after all that blood and sacrifice and time, the truth about the King in Yellow remains just out of reach, hidden behind veils of deception so deep and so deliberately constructed that even those who think they have found the answer have to admit, in their quietest and most honest moments, is that they might simply be seeing what they were meant to see. His name, if name it truly is the King in Yellow. If you have come here expecting a tidy answer, a clean reveal, a definitive statement that puts all questions to rest and sends you away satisfied, I have to be honest with you up front. The beauty of this mystery, the reason it has captivated lore enthusiasts and novel readers and theory crafters for more than a decade, is precisely that it refuses to be tidy. It refuses to be clean. Every answer opens into a larger question. Every piece of evidence can be read multiple ways. Every apparent confirmation carries within it the seed of doubt, planted deliberately by a writer who understands that the most powerful mysteries are the ones that don't resolve. They deepen. This is the kind of mystery that rewards obsession. It gets richer the deeper you go. It seems to lead somewhere specific, and then the path opens up into something larger and stranger than what you thought you were walking toward. So settle in, turn the lights down a little, close the door. We are going to take our time with this one, and we are going to start at the very beginning, which means starting not in the grim darkness of the far future at all, but in the late 19th century of our own world, with a book that has been quietly terrifying people for over 100 years, and with a concept so potent that it crossed a century of literary history to arrive, almost inevitably, in the darkest and most obsessive corner of modern fantasy fiction. Part 1. The source material. A Yellow King before the Grimdark. To understand why the King in Yellow is such a powerful concept, even before you place it in any Warhammer context, you need to understand the original. You need to understand the book that started everything, and the strange journey that book took through the history of horror fiction before it landed where it did. In 1895, a young American writer named Robert W. Chambers published a short story collection that has since been recognized as one of the foundational documents of cosmic horror. The book was called, simply, The King in Yellow, and it wasn't quite like anything else being published at the time. Victorian fiction had its Gothic traditions, Poe's psychological intensity, Sheridan Le Fanu's atmospheric dread, Bram Stoker's folkloric horror. But Chambers was doing something different, something that felt less rooted in any specific supernatural tradition, and more like a glimpse into a structure of reality that sat entirely outside human comprehension. The first 4 stories in the collection form a loose thematic whole. They share several strange, recurring elements. A mysterious and apparently cursed play, also called The King in Yellow, as which drives anyone who reads it to madness or worse. A symbol called the Yellow Sign, which marks and damns those who encounter it, and an entity, the King in Yellow himself, who is never directly described, never fully seen, whose presence is felt only through implication, through the reactions of characters who have glimpsed something they cannot adequately communicate. And behind all of it, a city called Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens and the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, and twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and something ancient and vast and utterly uncaring sits at the center of everything. What made Chambers' approach so unusual and so influential was the specific quality of the dread he cultivated. He never explained any of it directly. The King in Yellow, the entity, exists at the very edges of the stories. Its characters are destroyed or maddened by proximity to the play, to the sign, to the general atmosphere of the mythos. But the entity itself remains perpetually just out of focus, defined entirely by its effects rather than its nature. Chambers understood something that the best horror writers in any medium understand. The shape you imagine for the monster is always, without exception, more frightening than any shape the author could provide for you. The moment you define the horror, yet you have also defined its limits. Leave it undefined, and the reader's own mind creates something perfectly calibrated to their specific terror. The names and places Chambers used were borrowed and recombined from another writer, Ambrose Bierce, who had published his own strange stories, featuring a haunted ruin called Carcosa and a deity named Hastur. In Bierce's version, Hastur was benign, a shepherd's god, gentle and remote, a pastoral deity who watched over flocks and fields and caused no harm. Chambers took those names and bent them towards something entirely different. Where Bierce's Carcosa was melancholic, Chambers was dangerous. Where Bierce's Hastur was protective, whatever lurks behind Chambers' Yellow King is the opposite of protection. H.P. Lovecraft read the collection in early 1927 and was, by his own admission, immediately captivated. He described it as a masterpiece and incorporated its imagery into his own expanding Cthulhu mythos, the Lake of Hali, the yellow sign, the sense of something vast and utterly indifferent pressing against the thin membrane that separates the knowable world from the things that should not exist. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and one of the primary architects of the expanded shared world mythology, went further, so developing Hastur into a full Great Old One, a cosmic entity comparable to Cthulhu with his own cults and avatars and terrible purposes. Through Bierce to Chambers to Lovecraft to Derleth, the King in Yellow accumulated dread the way a glacier accumulates ice, slowly, silently, adding layer upon layer over time until the weight becomes something that reshapes the landscape around it. By the time it reached popular culture in the modern era, HBO's True Detective building an entire mystery around its imagery, the name and the yellow sign becoming touchstones of weird fiction that casual audiences recognized even without knowing their origin. The concept carried a freight of accumulated unease that had been loading for over 100 years. And then Dan Abnett, the man that many critics and fans consider the finest Warhammer 40,000 novelist currently alive. As looked at that name, that image, that specific quality of dread, and decided to put it here. In this universe, operating in the shadows behind everything that Eisenhorn and Ravenor have ever fought. This was not a casual choice. Abnett is a writer who reads widely, who draws on genuine literary tradition in ways that elevate his franchise fiction above the ordinary expectations of the genre. When he chose the King in Yellow as the name for the mysterious master figure behind his overarching Inquisition saga, he was invoking a lineage. He was saying to the readers who would recognize it, whatever this is, it belongs to the tradition of things that should not be named, things that madden those who look too closely, things that seem to have a purpose, but whose purpose, when you finally think you have grasped it, turns out to be something other than what you expected. That literary DNA is not incidental. It is fundamental to how this mystery works, and to why it has been so enduring and so compelling in the years since Abnett first planted the seeds of it in his Inquisition fiction. Part 1. B. From Carcosa to the Imperium. The full mythological lineage. To properly appreciate what Dan Abnett has built, it helps to trace the thread more fully. not just from Chambers to Warhammer, but through all the intermediate steps that built the mythology layer by layer until it became something with genuine weight. Because The King in Yellow did not jump directly from an 1895 short story collection into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. It passed through a relay of writers and thinkers and world builders who each added something, each deepened the implications, each made the imagery richer and stranger and more durable. As Robert Chambers himself was not writing cosmic horror, he was writing what he thought of as sophisticated literary fiction, stories that touched on art and decadence and psychological collapse, influences drawn from his time studying painting in Paris in the 1880s. He was interested in the symbolist movement, in the idea that certain images or phrases could carry emotional and psychological charges that exceeded their literal content, that art could break down the barrier between the aesthetic and the visceral. The King in Yellow was his experiment with applying that symbolist logic to narrative. What if a piece of writing could do to a reader what symbolist paintings tried to do to a viewer, but more completely, more invasively, more permanently? The device he invented, the play whose second act caused madness in everyone who read it, was elegant precisely because he never reproduced it. You never read the second act, but you only saw its effects, catalogued across a series of linked stories where different characters encountered the play under different circumstances and broke in different ways. The unknown text was more powerful than any specific text could be, because the reader's imagination, primed by the consequences, fills in something perfectly calibrated to their own deepest unease. H.P. Lovecraft read Chambers early in his career and acknowledged the influence directly. What he took from Chambers was not the specific imagery. Lovecraft developed his own iconography, but the structural principle, the horror that cannot be fully described, the truth that breaks the mind, not because it is violent or grotesque, but because it is simply too large for the cognitive architecture of a human being to accommodate. The unknowable as the primary source of terror, rather than the merely dangerous. Lovecraft extended this principle further than Chambers had, and applied it more consistently, and in doing so, created the template for a certain kind of speculative fiction that the 20th century returned to again and again. Chambers' specific entities got folded into Lovecraft's expanding mythology in ways that were not entirely systematic. Hastur, mentioned only in passing in Chambers as a name associated with the king and with the Lake Halley, became in August Derleth's later expansion of the Lovecraft mythos a full cosmic entity, was an old one in opposition to Cthulhu, something vast and ancient and very difficult to characterize. The yellow sign, which in Chambers was an ambiguous symbol that appeared on the garments of the king in Yellow's masked figure and seemed to function as a sort of mark or seal, became in later iterations a sigil with specific and terrible properties, a visual trigger that activated certain responses in those who saw it, and that marked bearers as related to or claimed by the king in some way that was not chosen and could not be revoked. The image that persisted most durably, the one that made it all the way through the relay into Warhammer 40,000, was the combination of the mask and the tattered yellow robes and the question of what lies beneath. In Chambers' stories, when a character encountered the king in yellow directly, not through the play but in person, the terrifying moment always came when the king removed his mask. In some stories, the removal is threatened. In some, it is completed. In none of them is what lies beneath adequately described. The horror is in the moment before description, in the protagonist's face as they confront the truth, in the sounds they make and the things they do afterward. Yet this image, the figure whose face is so terrible that seeing it destroys the viewer, whose yellow robes are described as tattered and draped in ways that suggest endless layers with no clear end, who moves through human spaces like a visitor from elsewhere simply tolerating the inconvenience of physical presence, is exactly what the Warhammer King in Yellow evokes, without reproducing it directly. The Warhammer King is not literally masked. He is not literally wearing yellow robes. Well, but the structural relationship, The figure whose true nature cannot be directly perceived, whose influence radiates outward across those who have encountered him, who makes everyone around him uncertain whether what they are seeing is real or constructed, is completely faithful to the Chamber's archetype. Abnett has spoken in interviews about his relationship to the Lovecraft mythos and to Chamber's work, and the connection is not accidental or casual. And he is a writer who reads widely and thinks architecturally about how literary traditions can be made to carry the weight of new narratives. When he places the king in yellow at the center of his Inquisition cycle, he is drawing on a deep tradition of fiction about unknowable power, about the cost of knowing, about the specific kind of madness that comes from understanding something your mind was not built to hold. And he is placing that tradition in conversation with the specific iconography and history of Warhammer 40,000 in ways that make both richer. There is also a more recent cultural layer worth considering, because the king in yellow has had a notable resurgence in popular culture in the years between when Abnett began the Bequin trilogy and the present. The television series True Detective in its first season used the king in yellow as a running reference, or weaving Chambers' imagery through a story about detectives pursuing a serial killer in rural Louisiana. The show introduced the imagery to an enormous audience that had no prior familiarity with the source material, and it did so with enough skill that the king in yellow became, briefly, a mainstream cultural touchstone, something people discussed and researched and became genuinely curious about, in exactly the way that Chambers intended his forbidden play to work on its fictional readers. The fact that this cultural resurgence happened during the same general period as the Bequin trilogy's development is probably coincidental. Abnett's interest in Chambers' work long predated True Detective, but it is worth noting that the fictional universe he was building had a structural resonance with mainstream popular culture's most prominent rediscovery of the source material, and that anyone who came to Warhammer fiction through that cultural moment found in the king in yellow a point of entry into the wider mythology that did not require any prior 40,000 knowledge to appreciate. There are fates worse than death in the lore of the 41st Millennium. There are mysteries darker than any chaos incursion. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in a galaxy of horrors is the question that makes you look at everything you thought you understood from a different angle and realize you cannot see the bottom of it. The king in yellow is that question. It always has been. Part 2. The Inquisition's worst nightmare. 2 hunters, 1 prey. To fully understand the weight that the king in yellow carries within the fiction of the 41st Millennium, you need to understand the 2 people most defined by their pursuit of this figure. Their names are Gregor Eisenhorn and Gideon Ravenor, and between them they represent the entire, complicated, morally tortured, endlessly fascinating soul of what it means to be an inquisitor in the darkest age of human history. The Inquisition of the 41st Millennium is one of the most morally ambiguous institutions in speculative fiction on paper. Inquisitors are the Imperium's ultimate investigators and enforcers, granted authority that supersedes planetary governments, capable of ordering entire populations put to death if the security of the Imperium demands it, armed with the sanction to do whatever is necessary to protect humanity from the forces of chaos, alien threat, and internal corruption. In practice, they are extraordinary individuals operating in a universe so comprehensively terrible that the distinction between the tools of darkness and the methods of light has been gradually, systematically eroded over 10,000 years of unending war. Gregor Eisenhorn began his career as something very close to an ideal. A Puritan inquisitor of the Amalathian faction, he believed in the sanctity of the institutions the Emperor built, or in the absolute necessity of protecting humanity from chaos by methods that kept the hunter's soul clean, in the idea that the ends could not simply justify any means because some means were themselves a form of contamination. He was not naive. You cannot become a successful inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos through naivety. But he held to a philosophy that had genuine coherence to it. The soul of the investigator mattered. How you won mattered. The method was part of the message. That philosophy was going to be tested until it bent, and eventually broke into something different and stranger, and arguably more honest. Over decades of investigation, across 3 novels and a cascade of short stories that trace the arc of one of the most compelling characters in franchise fiction, Eisenhorn watches friends die. He watches his carefully built organization destroyed by the machinations of an enemy who specifically targeted everything he cared about. And he watches himself make compromise after compromise after compromise, each one justified in the moment, each one a small step further from where he started, each one made in service of goals he still believed were righteous, even as the methods became ones his earlier self would not have recognized. By the time the story reaches the period of the Bequin trilogy, Eisenhorn is centuries old, sustained by juvenate treatments that preserve his body in a middle-aged approximation of health. He carrying a demon, an actual daemon, a demon prince named Cherubile, that he has subjugated and holds in service through his mastery of the primordial language called Enuncia. As his constant companion, he has been declared a radical by the Inquisition. He has been considered heretical at least twice and proven himself otherwise both times, though the reputation has stuck in ways that official exoneration cannot fully wash away. He is still hunting the king in yellow. He has been hunting the king for what feels like most of his very long life, and the pursuit has shaped him in ways he cannot always see clearly. Gideon Ravenor came to the same hunt along a different and perhaps even more brutal path. He was Eisenhorn's most gifted student, an interrogator, the junior rank of the Inquisition's investigative caste, who showed such extraordinary potential that his master remarked on it in terms that, from the usually restrained Eisenhorn, amounted to open amazement. Their relationship was warm in the particular way that relationships between brilliant, driven individuals tend to be warm, built on mutual respect and the productive friction of 2 exceptional minds that challenge each other without malice, that find the sparring of disagreement to be one of its own quiet pleasures. Ravenor's early career was marked by the precision and effectiveness you would expect from someone of his gifts. He investigated, he resolved, but he built a reputation as someone who combined psychic talent with rigorous investigative methodology in a way that produced results other inquisitors could not match. And then the Thracian Primaris disaster happened, and everything changed. At a celebration on the world of Thracian Primaris, marking the conclusion of the Ophidian Crusade, a carefully coordinated attack was unleashed. An Alpha Plus grade rogue psychers, the most dangerous category of uncontrolled psychic individuals in the entire Imperium, had been freed from their containment and set loose into the crowd. Ravenor was caught in the catastrophe. The damage to his physical body was absolute. 3rd-degree burns across every centimeter of his skin, organs catastrophically compromised. As the physical shell of one of the Inquisition's most gifted talents reduced to something that had no rational business still containing a living person. Ravenor refused to die. His will, amplified by the psychic potential that had always been his most extraordinary quality, held on against outcomes that should have been final. The solution provided by the Adeptus Mechanicus, the techno-religious organization that serves as the Imperium's engineering class, was something called a force chair, an enclosed life support capsule fitted with psi boosters that kept his ruined body functional and, through the psychic amplification of its systems, actually expanded the abilities that had always defined him. Ravenor lost his body. What he gained in exchange was something approaching psychic transcendence. Deprived of normal sensation, sealed inside a metal shell, his mind, no longer anchored by the ordinary demands and distractions of physical existence, expanded into spaces his flesh could never have reached. He became a different kind of hunter, a consciousness in a machine, reaching out across distances, reading intentions and memories with an intimacy that flesh and blood telepathy rarely achieves. By the time of the Bequin novels, set in the period around 500 years into the 41st millennium, has in a strange and ancient subsector called Angelus, on a world whose most significant city is called Queen Mab. Eisenhorn and Ravenor have become adversaries. Former master and most beloved student, now standing on opposite sides of the same investigation, both pursuing the king in yellow, both convinced that the other's methods represent a threat as significant as the quarry itself. The split between them is not a petty rivalry or a personal betrayal, while it reflects a genuine and profound disagreement about how to operate in a universe where the conventional tools of right action have been exhausted or compromised. Eisenhorn, increasingly radical, is willing to use the king's own machinery against him, to employ the tools of the Cogniti, to work with elements the Inquisition would consider tainted, to do things that would horrify his younger self in service of goals he still believes are just. Ravenor, despite everything, Ascend is still trying to do this the right way, still trying to preserve the principle that how you win matters, that the soul of the investigator is still part of the equation. And caught between them is a young woman called Beta Bequin. Beta is a pariah, what the Imperium calls an untouchable, one of those rare individuals whose very existence creates a null field in the psychic ocean, where most people interact with the warp in some small degree, simply through the act of being alive. Our pariahs are voids, holes. The warp doesn't touch them, doesn't reach them, can't get a grip on them. Demons find them deeply, almost physically, uncomfortable to be near. Psychers experience their presence as a kind of cold. They are weapons against the supernatural, simply by existing. Beta was raised in a facility she believed to be an inquisitorial training school, learning the skills of an agent, disguise, surveillance, meant the particular social arts of passing undetected through environments that would otherwise be hostile. What she eventually learns is that the facility was not what it claimed to be. The Maison Dieu was a Cogniti institution. She was trained by the enemy, shaped toward purposes she did not understand, placed into the middle of a conflict that she only partially comprehends, even as the books document her growing understanding of it. And she carries the same name as one of Eisenhorn's most beloved former companions, Elizabeth Bequin, a trusted member of his retinue from his earliest investigations. The original Elizabeth is long dead. Beta is described as a clone, or something very like a clone, which raises its own questions about continuity of identity and what it means to be the second iteration of a person who mattered to someone else. Beta is not just a viewpoint character, or a conveniently placed observer. She turns out to be one of the most important pieces on a board that has been set for 10,000 years. And it is Beta who, through circumstances that take the entire first two novels to arrange, finds the book. Part 3. The Language of Creation. Enuncia and Why It Matters. Enuncia is not a cipher, or a code, or a secret language in the ordinary sense. It is not a communications system invented by a particular culture or civilization to obscure information from outsiders. And it is something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any of those things. The lore describes Enuncia as a primordial language, something that predates human civilization, predates the Aeldari, possibly predates the current age of the galaxy entirely. A system of sounds and syllables and tonal configurations that, when produced with sufficient precision, do not simply convey meaning between speakers. They directly influence physical reality. They reshape matter. Yet they alter probability. They command the universe to rearrange itself according to what the words describe. Because on some fundamental level, at the deepest layer of reality, where physics and metaphysics meet, Enuncia is the language the universe was written in. This is not metaphor. In the 40,000 setting, where the warp is a real dimension, and psychic power is a real physical force, and the collective emotions of conscious beings literally create entities with independent existence and agency, the idea of a language that commands reality is not fantasy. It is applied physics, operating at a level beyond ordinary comprehension. When an enuncia utterance is spoken correctly, the words are not describing a desired outcome. They are enacting it, because at that level of reality, the description and the thing described are not fully separate. The danger is proportional to the power. An incorrectly pronounced enuncia syllable does not just fail to achieve its intended effect. It does something. What it does depends on what fragment of the fundamental linguistic structure was improperly invoked. but the range of possible consequences runs from minor physical distortion to cascading structural failures in local reality, to the inadvertent opening of channels between the material universe and the warp that are not easily closed. Enuncia forgives nothing. There is no approximate fluency. Either the pronunciation is exact, or which is extraordinarily difficult to achieve because human vocal architecture was not designed for sounds this precise, or the consequences are unpredictable. The Emperor knows enuncia. This is established in the Horus Heresy law as one of the pieces of evidence for the argument that the Emperor is something other than an ordinary human being who happened to be exceptionally powerful. An ordinary psyker who had studied for long enough could not learn enuncia, because the language requires a level of vocal and psychic control that no ordinary human being, however enhanced, possesses. The Emperor's knowledge of it is presented as evidence of either his inhumanly long study — he is described in some sources as being approximately 38,000 years old, which would give him time to learn essentially anything — or his inhuman nature, depending on which interpretation of the Emperor's origin story you find most compelling. Olanius person, the ancient recurring figure in 40K mythology who appears across tens of thousands of years of history in various forms, always as an ordinary human being who nonetheless endures, is connected to the Emperor's early involvement with enuncia in specific and interesting ways. What the Cogniti's foundational mythology involves the Emperor and Olanius person together, destroying an ancient tower where a previous civilization had been attempting to systematize and codify the use of enuncia. The Tower of Babel connection is not subtle. Abnet is drawing explicitly on one of the foundational myths of human civilization about the dangers of knowledge that reaches too high. The tower's inhabitants, in the Cogniti's version of history, they were not building a structure that reached toward God in the literal spatial sense. They were building a system of knowledge, a comprehensive grammar of enuncia that would have allowed ordinary practitioners to deploy it reliably without requiring the Emperor's level of intrinsic ability. The democratization of enuncia. And the Emperor destroyed it. Why? What the Cogniti's mythology frames this as tyranny. The Emperor destroying knowledge that would have freed humanity from dependence on his singular power. The more charitable interpretation is that the Emperor understood exactly what would happen if enuncia were made broadly accessible before humanity had the wisdom and the controlled conditions to use it safely. The history of every society that has encountered it suggests that the Emperor's caution was not unfounded. On every time enuncia appears in the law, the people using it are either the Emperor himself, operating with the precise control he alone possesses, or people who are suffering terrible consequences for their imprecision. The Cogniti's relationship to enuncia is central to what they are. They did not simply study the language. They organized their entire ancient institution around the project of recovering, preserving, and eventually deploying what the Emperor destroyed. Across what the law implies is an enormously long history, they have been accumulating fragments of the original grammatical system, testing pronunciations with methods that would make an ordinary inquisitor physically ill if they understood the specifics, building towards something like functional fluency across a succession of scholars and practitioners who each carried the project forward. The Emperor's true name in enuncia is the keystone of this project, not because knowing it gives power over him in a crude sense. He is not a demon to be commanded by the recitation of his secret name, but because enuncia operates on the principle that an entity's fundamental nature can be expressed in precise linguistic form, and that the correct expression of that nature in enuncia is not simply a description, but a direct engagement with the thing described. But to know the Emperor's true name in enuncia is to possess the ability to address the thing the Emperor actually is at the level where physics and metaphysics meet. What you do with that address, whether you use it to constrain, to restore, to release, to complete, depends entirely on the intent and the understanding of the person deploying it. And that ambiguity is the entire point. The Cogniti's interest in the name is presumably not benevolent, or at least not benevolent in any way that the Inquisition would recognize as such. Their institutional hostility to the Imperium as a structure means that whatever they would do with the Emperor's true name, they would do it in service of dismantling the authority that the Emperor's survival on the Golden Throne represents. Whether that means killing him, freeing him, or transforming what he is into something different. The Cogniti have had thousands of years to develop sophisticated and internally consistent theories about what the optimal use of this knowledge would be, and those theories are not ones that the Inquisition would endorse. The king in yellow's pursuit of the same knowledge is what makes the mystery so structurally interesting. Yes, if the king wants the emperor's true name in Annuncia for the same reasons the Cogniti wants it, to dismantle or transform the imperial institution in some radical way, then there is a certain dark logic to their association. But if the king wants it for different reasons, reasons that might actually align with the emperor's own intentions, rather than with the Cogniti's ancient grievances, then the king's use of Cogniti networks and resources is something more subtle, an infiltration, or a parallel track, or an exploitation of their capabilities in service of a goal they do not fully understand. The alternative is that this distinction does not exist, that the Cogniti, despite their institutional opposition to the Imperium, might include within their internal debate people who would consider restoring the emperor to full function, a legitimate use of the knowledge they have accumulated. Ancient organizations are never monolithic, and the Cogniti's centuries of existence have presumably produced internal factions with different views on what their foundational project actually means and what success would look like. If one such faction has aligned with the king, or if the king has found a way to represent himself to them as the completion of their most fundamental purpose, then the alliance makes a different kind of sense. The language of creation is the weapon. The question of who wields it and toward what end is the mystery. And the answer, whatever it is, will reshape the 41st millennium in ways that no bolter and no battle can achieve. Part 3b. The Cogniti. Older than the Imperium, patient as stone. If the Inquisition is the Imperium's immune system, the organization tasked with identifying and eliminating threats before they can spread, then the Cogniti is a disease that has been in the body since before the body knew it was a body. They predate the Imperium. They may predate the Unification Wars. They may predate, in their most fundamental organizational form, everything the Emperor did on Terra that eventually produced the Crusade and the galaxy-spanning structure of human civilization. Their name derives from cognitio, knowledge, the Latin root that also gives us cognition, the act of knowing. They are a knowledge organization in the deepest sense, not simply a repository of forbidden information, but a community organized around the principle that certain specific knowledge, accumulated and preserved through deliberate institutional effort, has the power to fundamentally change the world. Their internal hierarchy and culture are described in fragments across the Inquisition fiction in ways that suggest something closer to an esoteric order or a philosophical tradition than a criminal enterprise. People who join not for profit or power, but because they have encountered the beginning of what the Cogniti knows and cannot imagine returning to ignorance. What makes them more dangerous than most heretical organizations is their decentralization. Most threats the Inquisition faces have a central structure that, if sufficiently damaged, collapses the whole. Cut off the head, eliminate the leadership, remove the resource base. These are reliable strategies against organizations that depend on hierarchy and control. The Cogniti has survived for so long precisely because they do not depend on any single node. Cells operate independently. Knowledge is distributed in fragments such that no single cell's compromise reveals the whole picture. The organization as a whole can lose entire branches, can be effectively annihilated within specific sectors or on specific worlds, and continue to exist elsewhere, rebuilding from other cells that were never connected to the destroyed ones.
Okay, real talk for a second, and I mean genuinely stepping back from the lore here. This is probably my favorite unsolved mystery in all of 40k, and I've been into the setting for a long time. What gets me is that most big mysteries in 40k eventually get answered in a way that feels smaller than the question. But the King in Yellow, every answer Abnett gives you just opens 3 more doors. The Valdor reveal didn't close anything, it made the whole thing bigger. And I think that's because Dan Abnett actually understands what made the original Chambers story work. It's never the answer that haunts you, it's the not knowing. Personally, I think Valdor is real. I think he is the king, and I think he's doing something the Imperium genuinely can't afford to let him finish. Whether that's salvation or catastrophe, I honestly cannot tell yet. And I love that I can't tell. That uncertainty is exactly what keeps me coming back to this stuff. But anyways, let's get back into the video.
The Inquisition has been fighting the Cogniti for centuries and has never come close to destroying them. Because destroying them would require simultaneously locating and eliminating every operational cell across a galaxy, which is not a task any finite organization can accomplish. The most the Inquisition has ever achieved is setbacks, temporary degradations in capability, the loss of particular knowledge repositories or particular expert practitioners. The core of what the Cogniti is persists. Their relationship with the King in Yellow, as revealed in the Bequin trilogy, is not a simple alliance. It is layered with history and mutual use, and the kind of complicated power dynamics that ancient organizations develop when they interact over centuries. The King needs something the Cogniti has: access, expertise, infrastructure accumulated across millennia of operation in the Imperium's shadows. The Cogniti needs something the King has: resources, protection, but perhaps specific knowledge that the King's 10,000-year independent existence has produced that supplements what the Cogniti accumulated from their different angle. Whether either party trusts the other, whether the alliance is genuine or instrumental from one or both sides, or whether Beta Bequin's navigation through this web of ancient conspiracies is the story of someone discovering truth or someone being guided toward a destination that has been prepared for her. These are the questions that make the Bequin trilogy read like genuine spy fiction rather than action-adventure in Inquisitor's clothing. Before we talk about the book, before we arrive at the moment that changed the conversation of the entire lore community, well, we need to spend some time with something that runs beneath the surface of the entire mystery like an underground river. Enuncia, the primordial language. Most of the Warhammer universe's supernatural elements operate through the warp, the psychic ocean that exists alongside and beneath material reality, generated by the emotions and souls of conscious beings, shaped by the fears and desires and worship and suffering of living things across the galaxy into entities, currents, and forces. Honest psychers channel this ocean. Demons are made of it. The Chaos Gods are its most powerful expressions, vast consciousnesses crystallized from the deepest and most consistent currents of the psychic tides. Enuncia is different. It predates the current configuration of the warp. It operates at a level more fundamental than psychic power, not drawing on the ocean of human emotion and consciousness, but on something closer to the structural rules that determine how reality itself is organized. What's the best description offered in the lore is that Enuncia is the language of creation and unmaking, not metaphorically. A literal set of sounds and phonemes that, when pronounced with sufficient precision, alter the fabric of existence directly, without warp channeling, without demon bargaining, without the corrupting contamination that psychic power carries. The examples of what Enuncia can do, gleaned from scattered references across the Inquisition novels, are staggering in scope. And individual words have been used to control demons without negotiation, to compel entities that normally require either worship or bargaining into simple obedience. Words have been used as weapons that cause physical damage ranging from uncontrolled vomiting to skulls rupturing from the inside, without any visible mechanism. Or there are implications that sufficiently powerful enuncia utterances can alter time and reveal secrets and encode information in ways that conventional language cannot approach. The price is severe. Speaking enuncia damages the speaker. Individual words cause physical wounds to the mouth, the throat, the tissue of the face. Speaking more than a handful causes lasting injury. Remembering more than a small number of words simultaneously erodes sanity, and as though the language objects to being held in a human mind, as though the container is not designed for the contents and cracks under the pressure. But a complete lexicon of enuncia, all the words, all the phonemes, the full grammar of the language that underlies reality, would give its possessor something that goes beyond ordinary power. It would allow the rewriting of rules, the commanding of anything with a true name, yet the alteration of fundamental structures of existence that the Chaos Gods themselves cannot touch, because the Chaos Gods are made of the warp, and enuncia operates below the warp. Eisenhorn, over the course of his long career, has learned enough enuncia to use it as a weapon and to bind Cherubal, the demon prince, in his service, in ways that Chaos demon hosts usually cannot be bound. His mastery of even this partial lexicon marks him as extraordinarily dangerous. It also marks him as a radical in the Inquisition's eyes, because the use of knowledge that predates and supersedes the warp's normal rules carries connotations that the more doctrinaire members of the Inquisition cannot separate from heresy. The King in Yellow has been specifically, persistently, relentlessly pursuing a complete enuncia lexicon. That fact, in combination with the specific target of using enuncia to obtain the Emperor's true name, suggests a scope of ambition that is, or depending on your interpretation, either the greatest act of devotion or the greatest act of would-be usurpation in the history of the Imperium. What would it mean to know the Emperor's true name in enuncia? Not his given name, not the title, not any of the thousands of epithets and honors that have been applied to him over the course of his impossibly long life. His true name, the precise phonetic sequence in the language of creation that constitutes his fundamental identity, as the word that describes what he actually is, rather than what he has been called. In the logic of enuncia, knowing a true name of this type is equivalent to holding something like absolute knowledge of the named thing's nature. An absolute knowledge, in a language designed to operate on fundamental reality, is functionally equivalent to power over the named thing. Power over the Emperor, the God Emperor, the master of mankind, the entity whose existence maintains the Astronomicon, as the psychic lighthouse that guides ships through the warp, and without which human civilization spanning millions of worlds would collapse within a generation. The magnitude of what is being attempted here deserves a moment of stillness. This is not a villain with a plan to destabilize a sector or destroy a fleet or open a portal to the warp. And this is something reaching toward the pivot point of the entire human galaxy, the single entity whose existence or non-existence determines whether humanity as a species survives the 41st millennium or does not. The Cogniti's relationship to this project is ancient and complicated. Their origins, as glimpsed in the deep lore, stretch back beyond the Imperium, beyond the Great Crusade, past the Unification Wars, all the way to what Warhammer 40,000 presents as the dawn of recorded human history. A predecessor organization on ancient Terra attempted to build a tower etched with a near-complete enuncia codex, seeking to use that language to reshape human society according to their vision of what it should be, to rule over both chaos and humanity through words of power. The Emperor and a figure named Olainius Person led forces against that tower and destroyed it. The tower that Abnet's lore identifies, and through implication and deliberate narrative weight, with the Tower of Babel. That single connection tells you the scope of the Cogniti's timeline and ambitions. They are not a faction. They are an idea, an aspiration, a recurring attempt across the whole of human history to achieve a specific kind of mastery over reality. The Emperor has been their enemy since before civilization, as the Imperium understands it existed. Their hostility toward the Imperium and its institutions is not recent. It is primordial. Part 4. The King's Domain. What waits in the City of Dust? Let us talk about what the King in Yellow has actually built, because the scale of it is one of the most underappreciated aspects of this entire mystery. When Beta Bequin enters the pocket dimension known as the City of Dust during the events of Penitent, What she finds there defies easy categorization. The City of Dust exists outside both the material universe and the conventional warp, occupying a section of the Eldari Webway, that ancient sub-dimensional network that runs through and around real space, like the hidden circulatory system of a body that has mostly forgotten it has veins. The Eldari built the Webway across millions of years of civilization, a transit network that allowed their species to move between worlds without traversing the dangers of open warp travel. When their civilization collapsed in the catastrophe they call the Fall, most of the Webway fell into disrepair or became actively hostile territory claimed by things that should not exist, or simply went dark in ways that even the surviving Eldari cannot fully account for. Pockets remain. Some of them are genuinely vast, entire enclosed spaces that have no physical analog in the material universe, zones where the rules of ordinary existence apply imperfectly or not at all. As the King in Yellow has claimed one of these pockets and built, or found, or perhaps simply occupied it the way a creature occupies a shell it did not construct. A domain that functions as headquarters, fortress, laboratory, and staging area simultaneously. Inside the City of Dust, the outlines of the King's preparation become visible for the first time, and they are extraordinary. Thousands of winged space marines. Not space marines with equipment. It's not space marines whose armor incorporates wing mechanisms. Space marines with actual wings, biological modifications carrying the unmistakable genetic signature of Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels Legion, who died at the Siege of Terra, who flew on wings that were part of his divine inheritance, and who is arguably the most mourned figure in the whole of the Horus Heresy narrative. These warriors are unique. They should not exist. But the specific genetic modifications that gave Sanguinius his wings were not reliably transmitted even to his biological sons, the Blood Angels, and they are certainly not supposed to appear in a hidden Webway city belonging to an entity that the Inquisition considers an enemy of the Imperium. Their presence suggests several things simultaneously, all of them significant. A level of genetic mastery that borders on miraculous. Access to knowledge about Sanguinius's genome that has been lost to official Imperial science. Or possibly, a connection to the events of the Siege of Terra that goes far deeper than any record currently acknowledges. Because Sanguinius died protecting the Emperor. His sacrifice is woven into the spiritual fabric of the Imperium in ways that go beyond religion or mythology. If the King's plan involves anything connected to the Emperor's situation, to the Golden Throne, as to the possibility of restoration, to the completion of whatever the Emperor was building before Horus interrupted it, then the Angels' sons, however they were created, make a kind of terrible sense as part of the arsenal. There are also cloned blanks, not just a few, hundreds at minimum, psychically inert human beings, manufactured in quantity, each one a living void in the psychic ocean, each one a weapon that cancels warp energy simply through the fact of its existence. But the deliberate mass production and stockpiling of blanks at this scale indicates a specific strategic intent. You want this many blanks if you are planning an operation that requires a large zone of complete psychic suppression. An operation that needs to proceed without demons being able to interfere, without warp-active entities being able to sense what is happening, without the psychic tides of the Imperium being able to wash over and corrupt the process. What process? That is the question the law has not yet answered fully. There may also be custodians. The law is careful about this. It uses qualifications like possibly, but the implication sits there in the text and refuses to be ignored. If members of the Adeptus Custodes have pledged themselves to the King in Yellow, the implications radiate outward in multiple directions simultaneously. The Custodes answer to no institution, no imperial body, no council of high lords. Their loyalty is to the Emperor, directly and entirely. They do not serve the Imperium in any abstract sense. They serve a person. Their presence in the King's forces would suggest either a corruption so profound that the most carefully engineered loyalists in human history have been turned, or, and this possibility is so much more interesting, a situation where some custodes have concluded that their loyalty to the emperor is better served by what the king is doing than by continuing to stand vigil in a palace that houses a dying god and a bureaucracy that has fossilized around his throne. The Golden Fleet, a massive war fleet of powerful ships, not the scattered vessels of an underground movement, and not the repurposed freighters and hidden transports of a conspiracy that operates by necessity in small-scale ways. A fleet on a scale comparable to a legion of the Great Crusade era, assembled over time, positioned for action at the moment when the endgame of whatever this is finally begins. And then there is the galaxy-spanning network of mortal agents, informants, and operatives embedded in institutions across the Imperium. Threads of influence that extend into governments, academies, merchant organizations, and inquisitorial bodies, the accumulated investment of thousands of years of patient operation that has woven the king's reach through the fabric of the civilization he is supposedly threatening. The Aeldari response to the king's activities should be read as a calibration device for understanding how seriously all of this needs to be taken. 5 entire craft worlds were sent to the world of Sancor to address whatever the king was doing there. 5 craft worlds. The Aeldari do not mobilize craft worlds lightly. Each one is a self-contained civilization, a city ship carrying hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, the last physical expression of what was once the most sophisticated species in the galaxy. Their deployment represents an irreplaceable resource, a precious vessel that cannot be replaced if lost. For the Aeldari leadership, whoever they are in the current age, to authorize the deployment of 5 craft worlds toward a single engagement, they would have needed to assess what was happening on Sancor as nothing less than an existential concern, not a local threat, not a manageable crisis, something that, if allowed to reach completion, would alter the fundamental situation of everyone living in the galaxy. Part 4. B. The Webway. Humanity's lost dream and the King's hidden road. To understand why the City of Dust matters as a location, why a domain inside the Aeldari Webway is such a specific and loaded choice for the King's base of operations, you need to understand what the Webway actually is and what it was supposed to mean for humanity, because the story of the Emperor's Webway project is one of the most tragic narratives in the entire Horus Heresy cycle, and its ghost haunts everything that follows. The Webway is the Aeldari's great inheritance from an earlier age of the galaxy. It is a network of stable tunnels through subspace, not the warp, which is a churning sea of emotion and demonic power and fundamental unpredictability, but a separate dimension, carved and maintained by Aeldari craftwork over tens of thousands of years, that allows travel between distant points in real space without the spiritual and physical dangers of warp translation. You enter the Webway at one node, travel through tunnels that exist outside normal reality, and emerge at another node that might be light years away in the material universe. For the Aeldari in their empire's height, the Webway was the circulatory system of civilization. It connected their worlds, carried their commerce and their armies. It allowed a culture spread across the galaxy to maintain coherence and communication. When the fall of the Aeldari happened, when the birth scream of Slanesh tore through the warp with such force that it consumed most of the Aeldari population, physically destroyed most of the node infrastructure the Webway relied on, and filled sections of the network with warp energy and demonic presences that persist to this day. The Webway was damaged in ways that have never been fully repaired. Large sections remain inaccessible, sealed off behind barriers maintained by the surviving Aeldari, because what is inside them cannot be allowed to spread. But the Webway still exists. Its fundamental structure survived. And it is, in principle, accessible to species other than the Aeldari, if those species can find the entry points and survive what they find inside. The Emperor understood the Webway's significance long before the Crusade, as he had explored sections of it in his ancient wanderings across pre-space travel terror. He had accumulated knowledge of its structure and its possibilities that far exceeded anything any other human being possessed. And when he built the Imperial Palace on Terra, when he oversaw the construction of what is, objectively, At the most heavily fortified and largest single structure in the history of the human species, he built beneath it a secret project that was his deepest and most ambitious gamble. He was building a human entry point into the Webway, not borrowing or begging access from the Aeldari, who were protective of their network and had no reason to make it freely available to a species they regarded with cautious suspicion at best. But literally building human infrastructure into the subspace dimension of the Webway, threading pathways outward from beneath the Imperial Palace, creating a network that humanity could use and control, and eventually extend across the galaxy. The goal was to free humanity from the warp entirely, space travel without warp exposure, communication without psychic risk, as movement of armies and trade and people and ideas without the constant shadow of demonic influence that warp travel inevitably carried. The Webway project was the Emperor's plan to make humanity genuinely safe from the fundamental danger that the warp represented, and he considered it important enough that he withdrew from active leadership of the crusade to work on it personally, leaving Horus in command and asking, for the first and perhaps only time in his life, that people simply trust him. Then Magnus the Red tore the project open. Magnus, trying to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, using the only means available to him, a massive and almost uncontrolled psychic projection directly to Terra, broke through the wards that kept the human-built section of the Webway sealed against the warp. Demons poured in. The barriers were compromised. The Emperor's hidden legions, the Sisters of Silence and the Custodes, assigned to protect the project in total secrecy, found themselves fighting a demonic incursion inside a network of tunnels that was supposed to be humanity's greatest achievement. Hundreds of custodians died in those tunnels before the situation could be stabilized. The Webway project never recovered. The Imperial Palace's connection to the Webway still exists. There is a gate, maintained behind layers of protection so extreme that describing them strains language. What that gate connects to, on the other side, is a section of the Webway that was partly built by the Emperor and partly exists in the damaged and demonically compromised state that Magnus's action created. It is a border zone. It is neither fully the Aeldari Webway nor fully destroyed. It is a liminal space, haunted by the consequences of things that should never have happened. The City of Dust, and as best as the Bequin trilogy reveals it, occupies space within or adjacent to this network. Whether it is in the Aeldari Webway proper, in the Emperor's incomplete human extension, or in the contested territory between, the texts are not precise about the geography, and given the Webway's non-Euclidean nature, that imprecision may be inherent rather than evasive. What is clear is that the King's domain is accessible via Webway transit, that it is concealed from Aeldari Webway patrols, in ways that suggest either extreme skill or some kind of relationship with the network's deep architecture, and that its location within that space is itself meaningful. If Valdor is the king, and if Valdor knew about the Webway project, which, as Captain General of the Custodes, who were the project's secret defenders, yet he absolutely did, then his choice of the Webway as his domain's location is an explicit continuation of what the Emperor was building, not an abandonment of the project, but a preservation of its essential structure. The king has been maintaining a human presence in the Webway across 10,000 years, in exactly the liminal territory that the Emperor's project would have expanded into if it had not been destroyed. The Eldari response, 5 craft worlds to Sancor, and that extraordinary mobilization might be best explained through this lens. The Eldari tolerate the damaged sections of the Webway as a necessary loss. They do not tolerate the possibility of a human civilization establishing permanent infrastructure there. The memory of what human presence in the Webway was being built to become, an autonomous network that would have given humanity full independent access to Eldari pioneered subspace routes, potentially giving humans the ability to travel anywhere the Eldar could travel without Aeldari permission or oversight, makes the King's City of Dust not just a hidden base, but a precedent, a restoration of the project that the Aeldari spent the Horus Heresy, in part, watching fall apart with something that was not entirely unwelcome. 5 craft worlds is a statement. It says, We know what this represents. We know where it leads. We remember what the Emperor was building, and we are not going to allow it to be built again. Part 5. The name in the book. The revelation that changed everything. At the end of the second Bequin novel, Penitent, published in 2021 after what fans had endured as a 9-year gap from the first book in the series, something happened that sent a quiet shockwave through the entire 40,000 lore community. To understand the weight of the moment, you need to understand what came before it. In the first novel, Pariah, as Beta Bequin had navigated an extraordinarily dangerous series of encounters and managed to reach the king's domain, the City of Dust, and then escape from it. In the process of escaping, she took something with her. A book. Not a grimoire in the conventional sense, not a tome of demonic ritual or forbidden arcane instruction. Something stranger and, in retrospect, more precisely designed than that. The book contained a name, just a name, written across every page, filling the entire volume. Yet the identity of the king in yellow. But it was written in cipher, in a code so complex and deliberately obscured that even the most gifted cryptographers could not simply read it. Decoding it became a significant thread in the plot of Penitent, as Beta and those she was working with, sometimes Eisenhorn, sometimes Ravenor, sometimes figures from other parts of the story, worked to unravel the numerological and linguistic puzzles threaded through the text. In Penitent, the cipher is broken. The code is solved, and the first legible words of the decoded text, the answer to the question that had been waiting since the mystery was first introduced, were these: Constantin Valdor. The community response to that revelation was immediate, electric, and deeply engaged in ways that most fictional reveals rarely produce. People who had been following the Eisenhorn and Ravenor cycles for years, who had grown up with these books, who had the Horus heresy lore deeply embedded in their understanding of the universe, they immediately recognized the magnitude of what had just been implied. Discussion threads appeared on every platform where 40,000 fans gathered. Theories that had been circulating quietly, that some readers had suspected for years, were suddenly brought into sharp focus. And the debate began that has not fully settled to this day. Because here is the critical thing about this reveal. The thing that makes Abnett's handling of it so precisely, almost surgically, crafted. He does not confirm it. The text says this is the identity of the king in yellow. But the entire Bequin series is written in the tradition of spy thrillers, in a world where every piece of information is potentially misdirection, where the perspective of the narrator is explicitly limited and potentially compromised, is where the characters are themselves operating with incomplete information and potentially manipulated sources. The book Beta found could be completely genuine. It could be a deliberate plant, placed where she would find it. It could be an accurate record of who the king was at the beginning of this 10,000-year project, while being entirely wrong about who or what the king has become. It could be a name the king chose as an alias rather than an identity, a title, a mask. A deliberate piece of misdirection built into the very evidence the opposition would eventually find. Dan Abnett, in an interview following Penitent's release, said that the King in Yellow mystery is one of the aspects of the Bequin series he most loves readers speculating about. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He smiled, the way an author smiles when he has built exactly the puzzle he intended to build, and the pieces are in the places they are supposed to be. And he let the question hang in the air. The revelation is real. The debate about what the revelation actually means is ongoing. Both of those things are simultaneously true, which is precisely where Abnett wants us. Part 5b. The Girl Made of Absence. Beta Bequin and the Blank Condition. One of the reasons the Bequin trilogy hits differently from other Inquisition fiction is its narrator. Beta Bequin is not a typical Warhammer 40,000 protagonist. She is not a warrior of exceptional physical gifts, or a psyker of terrible power, or a strategist of genius intellect. She is, in the technical lore terminology, a blank, a pariah, a human being whose soul, or the psychic equivalent of a soul, is simply absent in a way that creates a void in the warp where a person should be. Blanks are one of the stranger concepts in 40K's already strange cosmology. In a universe where the warp is continuously shaped by the emotions and the psychic emanations of every living conscious being, where the sheer weight of human fear and desire and suffering creates literal demonic entities, where powerful psychers can reshape reality through concentrated will. A blank is like a hole in the universe's fabric. They do not contribute to the warp. They do not have a presence in it. They exist only in the material world. And that absence creates effects that range from uncomfortable to catastrophic, depending on the proximity and sensitivity of whoever encounters them. Psychically sensitive individuals, psychers, especially powerful ones, find blanks physically painful to be near. The sensation is described as the wrongness of encountering something that should not be possible, a violation of the background psychic ambience that their enhanced senses constantly interpret. Even ordinary people tend to feel unease around blanks without being able to articulate why. There is something in the mammalian social brain, apparently, that reads the absence of a psychic signature as a threat signal, that interprets the void where a person should be as something predatory or dangerous, even when the blank themselves is entirely harmless. As Beta Bequin navigates this condition throughout the trilogy with a self-awareness that is one of the most quietly devastating things in Abnett's writing. She understands that people instinctively distrust her. She understands that her usefulness to the Inquisition is directly tied to what she lacks, rather than what she has. She is valuable because her absence makes her a tool. And the question of whether she is more than a tool, whether the people who use her see her as a person rather than an instrument, runs through all three books as a persistent undercurrent. And then there is the question of her origin. Beta is a clone. She was grown from genetic material belonging to the original Elizabeth Bequin, Eisenhorn's longtime companion and ally. As a woman who lived and died, and was in many ways the emotional core of Eisenhorn's world across decades of inquisitorial service. The decision to name the new clone Beta, to make explicit that she is not the original, that she is a copy grown for specific purposes by specific people, is itself a statement about the tension between use and personhood that drives the trilogy. Why is a clone important? Why, specifically, would the Inquisition or the King, or someone in the complex web of the Bequin trilogy, want a blank clone of Elizabeth Bequin? Part of the answer is the nature of blanks themselves. Pariah-grade blanks, the most powerful, the ones whose absence creates the most profound disruption in the warp, are extraordinarily rare. They cannot be reliably produced through conventional breeding, because the genetic and perhaps metaphysical factors that create a blank are not well understood. Cloning from existing blank genetic material is one way to attempt reliable production of the trait, though even then the results are not guaranteed. But Elizabeth Bequin specifically carried a connection to the original Bequin family line that had its own significance in Eisenhorn's world, a significance accumulated across decades of shared history and specific experiences that gave her presence in that network a weight that a random blank would not have. Of course, the King and Yellow's forces include cloned blanks, plural, not just Beta. This suggests a program, a deliberate, sustained effort to produce blanks in quantity for specific operational purposes. The null field effect of massed blanks in close proximity would be enormous. A formation of pariah-grade blanks operating as a unit would represent one of the most profound anti-psychic weapons possible in the 40,000 setting, capable of disrupting demonic presences, shutting down psycho capabilities, and creating null environments where warp-sensitive work that would normally be impossible could be conducted safely. What work? The restoration of the Emperor's true name through enuncia. The completion of whatever the Emperor was building, spoken in the language that can literally reshape reality, in an environment where the warp cannot immediately respond and corrupt and devour the working before it is complete. The blanks are not random. They are the specific tool for the specific task. And Beta, the narrator, is in the position she occupies. at the intersection of every major player in this mystery, not by accident. She was placed there by someone, for reasons that the full 3-book arc has been slowly revealing. Whether she knows she was placed there, whether the Eisenhorn she trusts is the Eisenhorn she thinks she knows, whether any of the relationships she has built across the trilogy are what they appear to be. And these are the questions that make reading the Bequin series genuinely uncomfortable, in ways that the action sequences never are. The external threat is manageable. The uncertainty about whether the people around you are who you think they are is not. Part 6. The First of 10,000. Who was Constantin Valdor? The name Constantin Valdor hits differently depending on how deep into the lore you are. And for someone coming to the 40,000 setting primarily through the tabletop game or the more recent fiction, it might be just a name, possibly familiar from the Horus Heresy books, possibly not. For someone who has spent time with the Siege of Terror series, with the deep material about the founding of the Custodes and the Wars of Unification, the name lands with a weight that is almost physical. But this was the most important human being in the history of the Imperium, after the Emperor himself, and perhaps the Malcador the Sigillite. Not a Primarch, not a general, not a god or a saint or a figure of religious mythology. A man, enhanced, yes, modified beyond what ordinary humanity contains, shaped by the Emperor's hands into something that transcended normal categories, who stood closer to the master of mankind, knew him more intimately, served him more consistently, yet and understood him more completely than almost any other living thing. His origins are themselves mysterious in ways that seem, in retrospect, deliberate. According to accounts attributed to the scientist Amara Starte, the Emperor ordered the death of Valdor's biological parents and mobilized entire armies across continents on a young terror to locate and retrieve a specific child. Valdor himself remembers almost nothing from the period of his existence before becoming the Emperor's servant. His memory of a life before the Emperor's service is essentially blank, as though that prior existence was so thoroughly overwritten by what came after that it ceased to be real. He cannot say with certainty whether he was truly the first custodian or simply the first one who survived the process that created them. The Emperor remade him, as he remade all of his custodians, as through genetic manipulation, surgical modification, and processes that went beyond what either conventional biology or the standard space marine creation protocols encompassed. But Valdor was apparently re-engineered from raw materials so extraordinary that even the Emperor, who made demigods as a routine function of his work, who created the Primarchs as essentially divine beings in human form, considered him worth moving armies to obtain. As a warrior, Valdor occupied a position in the Warhammer hierarchy that almost no other mortal could claim. The Primarchs, those 20 demigod sons of the Emperor, each one a staggering concentration of physical power and psychic presence, were considered the most dangerous individual combatants in the Imperium. The question, could Valdor fight a Primarch, is one of those discussions that the lore actually invites rather than shuts down, and the answer it implies is yes, under the right conditions. As against certain Primarchs, he held a stalemate against Alfarius, one of the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, admittedly among the physically less imposing of the Emperor's sons, but still a genetic masterwork, without even understanding who he was fighting. He killed 30 elite Thousand Sons Blademasters on Prospero, warriors who used psychic precognition to anticipate their opponent's moves, and received a single wound in the process. His political position was extraordinary in ways that his typical characterization as a bodyguard somewhat undersells. By the end of the Unification Wars, the campaigns that consolidated the Emperor's control over ancient terror before the Great Crusade was launched to reclaim the lost human colony worlds among the stars, Valdor had become part of a ruling triumvirate alongside the Emperor himself and the Sigillite Malcador. Not just the Emperor's sword, not just his shield, his counselor. As a figure who helped make decisions, who offered perspective, who sat at the center of imperial power and understood what that power was actually trying to accomplish. He was at Prospero when the world burned. The Emperor dispatched Lemon Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus the Red to to account for sorcery performed in violation of the Council of Nicaea's edicts. And Valdor went with them, the Emperor's direct representative, on a mission of punishment that would have vast and terrible consequences for the subsequent trajectory of the heresy. On that scarred and burning world, Valdor fought his way through some of the most gifted psychic warriors the Thousand Sons had produced, and moving through their defenses with a lethal efficiency that the law records with the specific kind of breathless shorthand it reserves for acts that don't require elaboration because the numbers speak for themselves. He was present throughout the Siege of Terror, the apocalyptic final confrontation of the Horus heresy, as the traitor legions of the War Master hammered at the walls of the Imperial Palace, while demons poured through tears in the fabric of reality, and titans walked among the ruins of what had been the center of human civilization. He was on the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's massive battle barge, during the final boarding action, the desperate last gambit that would determine everything. Now he was separated from the Emperor in the darkness and found himself surrounded by demonic entities in a void constructed to break him, to make him feel the particular agony of being unable to fulfill his purpose. He killed his way through. He was badly wounded by warriors in Terminator armor, warriors who would have destroyed most things that lived. He kept going. He cut Abaddon with the Apollonian spear. And in that moment, the blade entering the future despoiler's flesh, or the spear doing what it was always designed to do, Valdor received a vision that the law does not describe fully but describes enough. He saw something, 10,000 years of something. He looked at a young warrior called Ezekiel Abaddon and spoke a word, despoiler, that Abaddon would not make fully true for centuries afterward, but which was already true in whatever form the Apollonian spear showed it to Valdor. He knew, in that moment on the Vengeful Spirit, west in the midst of the worst battle in human history, Valdor knew what was going to happen, what the next 10,000 years would look like, the Black Crusades, the Long War, the slow erosion of everything the Emperor had built and everything Valdor had given his life to protecting. He held that knowledge in a single instant of combat, and then he kept fighting, because that is what Valdor did. The Apollonian spear is central to everything that comes after, and it deserves specific attention here. It was made by the Emperor himself in his very first underground fortress on Terra during the Age of Strife, before the Unification Wars began. It was made alongside a sister weapon, the Dionysian spear, 2 blades, each named for one of the ancient Greek gods of opposing aspects of human experience: Apollo and Dionysus, reason and passion, light and depth. The 2 spears were described as spiritual opposites that both dealt in revelation. Yet the Dionysian spear illuminated those it pierced, showed them something true about themselves, their nature, their path. The Apollonian spear ran in the other direction. It granted knowledge to the wielder from those it cut. Every enemy slain, every soul the blade touched, passed something of their truth into the spear, and through the spear into Valdor. The Emperor gave the Apollonian spear to Valdor as a check on his power, according to the law, not to limit his combat effectiveness, but to prevent him from becoming too callous about killing. The idea was that if every kill gave Valdor a glimpse of the nature and the story of the thing he was destroying, he could not become purely mechanical about violence. He would always know what he was ending, but the Emperor did not anticipate, or perhaps did anticipate and considered worth the risk. What would happen if Valdor spent decades killing demons, killing Chaos Space Marines, killing the most corrupted and psychically powerful entities in a universe of corrupted and psychically powerful entities? Each kill, each brush with the spear's truth-revealing quality, added to a composite picture of the warp, of chaos, of the actual nature of the forces arrayed against humanity that no other living person possessed. By the time of the Siege of Terror, as Valdor understood demons and traitors and the chaos gods themselves with a directness and intimacy that came not from books or briefings or second-hand reports, but from 10,000 individual acts of violence that each delivered a fragment of direct knowledge. After the siege, after the Emperor was carried broken and agonized to the device that would sustain his ruined body for 10,000 years, as after the weeping, and the grief and the terrible silence that followed the Imperium's most catastrophic victory. Valdor resigned the captain generalcy of the Custodes. And then, one night, without announcement, without explanation, without saying goodbye to the 10,000 he had founded and led, he walked out of the Imperial Palace. He stopped at the entrance, turned back one last time, and spoke into the quiet air the first half of a well-known imperial oath. Only in death does duty end. His weapons and armor, objects that should have been interred as sacred relics in the Hall of Armaments, were not found. They were gone with him. The custodes he had trained, the organization he had built from the very first prototype of what a custodian could be, had no idea where he went. His whereabouts were not recorded, his mission was not recorded. Even the Adeptus Custodes, who maintain more thorough records than most imperial institutions, registered him simply as one of 3 captains general who disappeared without explanation, leaving nothing behind but questions. 10,000 years later, in a book recovered from a pocket dimension in the Webway, his name appeared at the beginning of a decoded cipher that answered the question of who the King in Yellow is. In one of the most illuminating moments involving Valdor in all the Horus heresy lore comes near the end of the Siege of Terror, during the moments immediately following his wounding of Abaddon. He had just driven the Apollonian spear into Ezekiel Abaddon, Horus's first captain, the man who would become the War Master of Chaos, the individual whose black crusades would define the next 10,000 years of galactic conflict. And the spear had done its thing. It had shown Valdor the truth of the man he had almost killed. What Valdor saw in that flash of spear-granted revelation was 10,000 years of future. He saw the despoiler. He saw Black Crusade after Black Crusade, each one hammering at the defenses of the Imperium, each one failing in the grand tactical sense, while succeeding in the deeper strategic purpose of bleeding humanity dry, killing heroes and consuming resources and corroding morale across generations. Yet he called Abaddon by the name he would not earn for centuries. He called him Despoiler, because the spear showed him what Abaddon would do before Abaddon himself fully knew. The weight of that vision is almost impossible to calculate. To be shown in a single instant of combat, the specific and detailed future suffering of the species you have devoted your existence to protecting. To know, with the absolute certainty that direct revelation provides rather than speculation or prophecy, that the war is not ending at the Siege of Terror, that the war is never ending, that the cost will be measured in ways that would be meaningless to try to describe in finite terms. That is what the Apollonian spear gave to Valdor at the siege's climax. And then the siege ended, and the Emperor was carried to the Golden Throne, and the Imperium began its grim calcification into the institution it would be for the next 10,000 years. And Valdor stood in the wreckage and knew, how with a certainty that no one else in the history of the Imperium would ever possess, exactly how bad the next 100 centuries were going to be. He left. Part 7. The Disappearance and the Oath. 10,000 years of questions. The timing of Valdor's disappearance is worth examining carefully, because the lore places it in specific company that changes the meaning. He disappeared around the same time as Leman Russ. Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, the warrior king of Fenris, perhaps the most physically direct and personally loyal of all the Emperor's sons. He too vanished in the period following the Horus heresy. His departure was accompanied by more ceremony, more public acknowledgement, more explicit framing as a journey rather than a disappearance. He told his sons he was going to find something, implied that he might return when the time was right, and left with the kind of mythological weight that comes from a Primarch who understands the value of a good legend. The Space Wolves have spent 10,000 years maintaining the faith that he will come back. But the departure itself happened in the same general window as Valdor's. Two of the most powerful and most loyal figures in the entire Imperium, the first custodian and one of the most beloved Primarchs, both leaving in the aftermath of the Siege of Terror, are both under circumstances that suggested purpose rather than grief, both carrying weapons that the Emperor had personally made and that were described as instruments of revelation. The lore contains a passage about Valdor and Russ, each experiencing psychic visions. The visions apparently connected to their respective emperor-crafted weapons around the same period. What they saw in those visions is not described fully. What the visions caused, apparently, or was both men deciding that remaining in the imperial palace and continuing to serve the Imperium as it was being constituted around the broken emperor was not the correct use of their remaining existence. Valdor said, "Only in death," as he left. This half-sentence has been analyzed extensively in fan discussions, and the analysis keeps pointing toward the same interpretation. He was not saying his duty was finished, he was saying his duty continued. The full phrase, "Only in death does duty end," means that as long as you are alive, the work is not complete. He walked out not as someone abandoning his post, but as someone whose understanding of what his post actually required had expanded beyond what the imperial palace could contain. Whether the emperor sent him, whether the emperor communicated something through the Apollonian spear, or through some other channel before being sealed away on the throne, or whether Valdor made an independent decision based on his own understanding of what the next 10,000 years would require, these are questions the lore holds open, and they are questions with different answers depending on which theory of the King in Yellow you find most compelling. But the words he chose as he left were not the words of a man who had lost faith. They were the words of a man beginning something. Part 8. Why would the shield become the king? Our theories in the dark. This is where speculation begins in earnest, and where the richness of the mystery becomes most apparent. The central question, if Valdor is truly the king in Yellow, and we are taking that as our working assumption, is not simply who he is, it is why. What happened across 10,000 years of operating in the shadows that produced this specific configuration of forces, this specific set of goals? This specific and deeply ambiguous relationship with the institutions of the Imperium. There are several major theories, and they are not mutually exclusive. Each one illuminates a different aspect of what is known. The first theory, the most charitable and arguably the most interesting, is that Valdor is not the enemy, that the characterization of him as a threat is a misreading by inquisitors who are applying the standards and values of an Imperium that he does not serve. Us never agreed to serve, and that is itself a profound perversion of everything the Emperor was actually trying to accomplish. Valdor's loyalty was always, explicitly, to the Emperor specifically, not to the Imperium as an institution, not to the ecclesiarchy and its theology, which would have been completely unrecognizable to the Emperor himself, not to the High Lords of Terror or the bureaucratic machinery that hardened around the Golden Throne like a shell around something soft and vulnerable. To a person, to a man of staggering power and intelligence and purpose who happens to currently be imprisoned in a device designed to keep a dying body functional, consuming 1,000 psychically sensitive human lives per day just to keep a lighthouse burning. Every time this distinction is discussed in the Horus Heresy lore, Valdor makes his position clear with characteristic economy of language. He is the Emperor's bodyguard, not the Imperium's bodyguard, not humanity's bodyguard, the Emperor's. And the Emperor, whatever he has become on the Golden Throne, is still there, still conscious on some level, still exerting influence through dreams and visions and the vast psychic presence that makes the Astronomicon possible. If the King in Yellow is Valdor operating on a mission the Emperor assigned, either directly, before the siege, or through some channel that remains open between the spear and its maker, or through Valdor's own 10,000-year study of what the Emperor was building and what that building requires, then his activities transform in meaning. The blanks are not a weapon against the Emperor. They are a shield for the Emperor, a null environment that could allow something to happen in proximity to the Golden Throne that would otherwise be immediately consumed by demonic interference. The Emperor's true name is not a key to controlling him. It is protection, the specific, precise knowledge necessary to speak something into being, to articulate the Emperor's restoration in the language that can actually accomplish it rather than the language of ordinary human speech. The winged space marines, the possible sanguineous heirs, are there because the sacrifice of the angel was built into the deep structure of whatever the emperor was creating. And any completion of that structure might require what Sanguinius gave, and something carrying the genetic memory of that giving. If this is correct, then everything the Inquisition has been doing in hunting the King in Yellow is a tragedy. Eisenhorn and Ravener, two brilliant and devoted servants of the Emperor, spending centuries trying to stop the only being in the galaxy who is genuinely working to save the Emperor, while the institutions they serve, the Inquisition and the broader Imperium, are the very petrification that the King's mission is designed to overcome. The second major theory is corruption, not of the chaos variety, but of something more internal and arguably more sad. 10,000 years is an incomprehensible length of time. Valdor was remade as something more than human, and his physical body may be capable of sustaining consciousness across that span in ways that ordinary biology cannot. But what 10,000 years of isolation, of operating in the shadows, of carrying the weight of the knowledge that the Apollonian spear has accumulated? What does that do to a person? Even an extraordinary person, even perhaps the most exceptional person who ever lived outside of the Emperor himself. The Apollonian spear showed Valdor the truth of Abaddon in an instant, and the sight horrified him, left him unsettled and raw in ways that his stoic nature had rarely shown. What has it shown him in 10,000 years of continued use? What picture of the universe has been built up in his consciousness, one killed enemy at a time, one fragment of warped truth at a time, until the total weight of it amounts to something no single mind was designed to carry? There is a version of this story in which the most loyal servant in history became, through the sheer pressure of everything he knew and everything he had seen, as something that still believes itself to be serving the Emperor's will, but has lost the ability to accurately distinguish between the Emperor's actual intentions and Valdor's own interpretation of what those intentions must be. A 10,000-year-old certainty, accumulated across isolation and unimaginable experience, can produce conviction so absolute that it becomes indistinguishable from delusion. As the third theory operates on the spy thriller logic that the Bequin series is deliberately built from, and it refuses to dismiss the simplest explanation. The book was a plant. The information was placed. What Beta found, what Eisenhorn and Ravenor have been building toward, was designed to lead them to a specific conclusion by someone who wanted them to reach exactly that conclusion. Maybe the King in Yellow is not Valdor at all. Maybe Valdor is a name attached to the King's operations, as a layer of cover identity that has been maintained long enough and consistently enough that it has become the dominant story, the story that enemies believe, that allies believe, that has obscured whatever the true nature of the King actually is. In a setting where the Alpha Legion literally defines itself by the principle that any information you have about it is probably wrong, thus the possibility that the central reveal of a spy fiction mystery series is itself a misdirection cannot be simply dismissed. Maybe Valdor was used. Maybe someone or something with access to his legend, his weapons, his name, possibly even a fragment of his psychic imprint accumulated through the Apollonian spear over its years of truth-gathering, has been using that identity as a shell while Valdor himself has been dead for 9,000 years or imprisoned, or otherwise removed from the picture. The fourth theory, and the one that connects to the broadest implications for the 40,000 setting as a whole, involves what some lore sources call the Dark King. During the climactic confrontation of the Siege of Terra, the Emperor drew warp energy into himself in quantities that, according to some accounts, brought him close to a threshold that no human being, not even the Emperor, was supposed to cross. The threshold of becoming a god. Us not a patron or a psychic beacon or an empowered consciousness, but an actual chaos god, a fifth presence in the warp, to stand alongside Horn and Sinch and Nurgle and Slanesh, shaped from the accumulated psychic weight of human suffering and devotion and death. Some accounts suggest that the Emperor shed this power, deliberately cast it away, rather than allow himself to become what chaos wanted him to become. But power of that magnitude does not cease to exist simply because it is rejected. It persists. It waits. It looks for expression. If the Emperor's discarded potential godhood drifted into the warp and has been slowly forming into something over 10,000 years, waiting for conditions that would allow it to act, and if that something needed a vessel, a face, an identity that could move in the material universe, then the King in Yellow becomes something almost incomprehensible in its scope. Not Valdor, not even a person in the traditional sense, something wearing a person's identity the way the original Chambers entity wore tattered yellow robes, as a garment, not a definition. All of these theories are consistent with the available evidence. Abnett has been careful not to close any of them off. The ambiguity is not a weakness in the storytelling, it is the storytelling. At Part 9, everyone wants the King, the full enemy roster. One of the clearest measures of how significant the King in Yellow's activities have become is the range and diversity of the forces working against him. When loyal Imperial organizations and Chaos Space Marine legions are independently trying to stop you from doing the same thing, when the opposition list spans every major faction in the setting, you are operating in territory that transcends ordinary conflict. The Inquisition, while represented primarily by Eisenhorn and Ravenor, has been the spine of the hunt. Their opposition is documented across multiple novel series spanning decades of publication. Ravenor's approach is methodical. He sees the King as an existential threat to the Imperium's stability and pursues him through the institutional channels available to an Inquisitor, building cases, gathering evidence, working within the systems of the Inquisition, even when those systems are slow and imperfect. Eisenhorn's approach has become increasingly radical. He is willing to operate outside those systems, to use the King's own tools and networks, if that is what it takes, to accept the label of heretic if the alternative is failing at the one task that matters. The tension between them, teacher and student, Puritan and radical, the right way and the necessary way, is one of the most intellectually rich conflicts in the Bequin series, and it mirrors the tension that runs through all of Dan Abnett's Inquisition fiction, the question of what you are allowed to do in the service of a genuinely good cause. The traitor legions present a more complicated and more interesting picture. Multiple Chaos Space Marine forces have actively opposed the King's activities. The Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, the Emperor's Children, the Night Lords, the Thousand Sons and the Iron Warriors are all mentioned as adversaries. This breadth of chaos opposition is one of the most significant data points in the entire mystery, because it directly addresses the question of whether the King's goals serve chaos. They do not. The traitor legions do not oppose the King out of loyalty to the Imperium. They oppose him out of self-interest. Whatever the King is attempting, it threatens something the Chaos powers have a direct stake in preserving. The most obvious candidate is the Emperor's current state, the slow, agonized existence on the Golden Throne that keeps him alive but not fully present, not fully himself, not fully whatever he was actually becoming before Horus interrupted the process. The Chaos Gods do not want the Emperor restored. A fully present Emperor in possession of his complete power and his original vision, with 10,000 years of accumulated grievance and understanding to draw on. That is the single entity the ruinous powers would most prefer not to face. If the King in Yellow is trying to bring that about, then the Chaos Legion's opposition makes complete sense. They are not doing the Imperium a favor, they are protecting themselves. The Aeldari response, as mentioned earlier, is 5 craft worlds deployed to Sancor. There is something in what the King was attempting there that the Aeldari considered worth that level of commitment. Their motivations for opposition are harder to read. The Aeldari relationship with the Webway, with the Emperor's interrupted Webway project, the plan he was working on when Magnus the Red's fateful psychic message tore open the protections and flooded the human-built portion of the network with demons. And with the broader question of what humanity's psychic destiny might be, all of these create complex and potentially contradictory motivations for how they view the King in Yellow's project. Perhaps the King's use of the Webway as a domain offends them on principle, and perhaps what was being built on Sancor would have destabilized the Webway in ways that threatened craftworld navigation and safety. Perhaps they have information about the king's true nature that the Inquisition does not yet possess, and their response reflects a knowledge of what is actually at stake rather than simply what appears to be at stake. Whatever the reason, the image of 5 craft worlds mobilizing is one of the most dramatic implications in the entire King in Yellow mystery, and it has received less attention than it deserves. Part 10. What does the King actually want? The Emperor's name and everything it means. Strip away all the speculation, all the competing theories, all the layers of spy fiction misdirection, and you are left with a question both simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to answer. What does the King in Yellow actually want to accomplish? Everything points toward the Emperor. The searches conducted across the planet of the sorcerers, us at Sikaris, at the Black Library, the 3 most significant repositories of arcane knowledge in the accessible galaxy, each of them connected in different ways to chaos, to forbidden history, to records of things that have been erased from official sources. The King has visited all of them, apparently, in the pursuit of the Emperor's true name in Annuncia. The accumulation of blanks creates the null environment that would allow work to be done near the Emperor without warp interference. The winged space marines connect to Sanguinius, whose sacrifice and whose genetic legacy are woven into the spiritual fabric of the Emperor's current existence in ways that the lore has not fully explained. But pointing toward the Emperor covers a vast range of possible intentions. The Inquisition's assessment, the working conclusion that drives Ravenor's investigation, is that the King wants to control the Emperor. That knowledge of the Emperor's true name in Annuncia would provide something functionally equivalent to dominion over the single most powerful entity in the Imperium. This is the straightforward villain reading, someone who wants to seize the pivot point of the human galaxy and use it for their own ends. This reading has the advantage of being simple and the disadvantage of being hard to reconcile with certain facts. Where if you wanted to control the Emperor and use that control for purposes that served conventional villainy, power, influence, the satisfaction of breaking something enormous, why would Chaos Space Marine legions be your enemies? The Chaos powers and their mortal servants have every reason to want the Emperor controlled, especially in ways that would prevent his restoration or weaponization against them. If the King were working toward chaos-friendly ends, the traitor legions would be allies, us not adversaries. The more sophisticated reading, the reading that holds up better under sustained scrutiny, is that what the King wants is to complete the Emperor's work, to accomplish what the Horus Heresy interrupted, to bring about what the Emperor was actually building before the worst war in human history derailed everything. What was the Emperor building? The imperial truth, the secular, a rational civilization freed from the grip of superstition and religion that he believed was humanity's only path to genuine, long-term survival. The Webway project, the creation of a human-accessible route through the Aeldari's ancient network that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and the catastrophic risks that came with it. And perhaps, according to the deepest implications of the Horus Heresy lore, he is something connected to his own transformation, something involving the psychic potential of the human species as a whole, the possibility of a future where humanity was not simply prey for the warp's predations, but something that could genuinely stand against them. If Valdor is the King, and if Valdor understood the Emperor's true plan, understood it more completely than any of the Primarchs, more completely than Malcador, more completely than anyone who has lived in the 10,000 years since, then his 10,000-year project begins to look not like villainy, but like the longest patience in human history, waiting, preparing, building the specific tools that the specific moment requires, waiting for the conditions to be right. The current state of the 41st millennium, ours with the Great Rift tearing the galaxy in half, and Guilliman returned and everything in a state of unprecedented flux, that might be the moment he has been waiting for. The moment when the project that began with a half-spoken oath at the door of the Imperial Palace finally approaches its completion. There is also the question of what the Emperor's restoration would actually mean. Not just survival. The Emperor already survives. While in the most technically literal, and most horrible sense of that word. Restoration, return to something like what he was. And with 10,000 years of accumulated psychic energy, 10,000 years of human prayer and devotion and worship, prayers that the Emperor himself never wanted and that are themselves a perversion of everything he intended, he might be returning to something far more powerful and far stranger than what he was before. Whilst the Grey Knights' terminus decree, their deepest and most terrible contingency plan, hinted at in the lore, is apparently a plan to prevent the Emperor's resurrection rather than enable it. The implication is that some within the Imperium's most secret institutions believe that what would return might not be the Emperor anymore. That 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, surrounded by the psychic weight of 1 trillion prayers, Charm may have changed him into something that needs to be treated with the same care as any other warp entity of comparable power. If this is true, if the thing that returns might not be recognizably the Emperor anymore, then the King's project becomes a knife's edge, an attempt to bring back something essential to human survival that might, if handled wrongly or at the wrong moment or with insufficient understanding of what it has become, produce something catastrophic beyond calculation. Yet that ambiguity, salvation and disaster, occupying the exact same space, indistinguishable until the moment of completion, is the most Warhammer 40,000 thing imaginable. Of course, the plan that might save humanity also might destroy it. Of course, the most loyal servant might be the greatest threat. Of course, the answer, when it finally comes, will not be clean. Part 11, Pandemonium and the future that hasn't been written yet. As this is being recorded, the third and final Bequin novel remains unpublished. Its title, Pandemonium, carries an explicit weight. John Milton's name for the capital of hell in Paradise Lost, the gathering place of all demonic powers, the congress of every infernal force called to council at Satan's court. In the context of the Bequin trilogy, it promises a conclusion of matching scale, a gathering, an assembly, in a moment when all the forces that have been moving in their separate orbits for hundreds of years are finally in the same place at the same time. Dan Abnett has said it will be big. He has said it will be significant. He has said it will change everything. These are not the qualifications of an author building to a modest resolution. This is someone who has been constructing something across over 20 years of fiction writing, who seeded connections between the Horus Heresy era and the 41st Millennium with the patience of someone who understood that the payoff was worth the length of the wait, announcing that the payoff is coming. What will change? What does change everything mean in the context of 40K lore specifically? If the King in Yellow is genuinely Valdor, and if his mission is connected to the Emperor's situation in any way that affects it at a structural level, then Pandemonium could be the most significant Black Library publication since the conclusion of the Siege of Terror series. Because what Abnett has been threading across the entirety of his Inquisition cycle, it is a connection between the events of 10,000 years ago and the current state of the 41st Millennium that the mainstream 40K narrative, the tabletop game's current edition lore, has not addressed. The mainstream current lore has the Emperor still on the Golden Throne, still alive in the most technical sense, still powering the Astronomicon, still receiving his daily 1,000 souls. But the question of what happens if or when that situation changes is one that Games Workshop has been carefully avoiding for decades, partly because any resolution would significantly constrain the setting's ongoing story. But Abnett has always operated slightly outside that constraint. His Inquisition cycle has always been set in the margins of the mainstream narrative, in the spaces between the big events, following characters whose actions have consequences that ripple through the broader setting without being the headline story. If Pandemonium brings the King in Yellow's mission to its conclusion, if it shows what Valdor has been building toward and whether it succeeds or fails, it might do so in a way that leaves the mainstream setting intact while adding a layer of meaning that changes how the whole thing reads, or it might do something more drastic. After the timing of the cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, the galaxy-splitting wound in reality that defines the current 40,000 timeline, has been connected in fan theory to the activities of the king in yellow. The argument goes that the events of the Angelus subsector, whatever was being attempted on Sancor and in Queen Mab, contributed to or caused the specific conditions that tore the galaxy open. That the Great Rift was not simply a chaos event, but a consequence of the king's project reaching a certain stage, with the galaxy-scale disruption as either a necessary side effect or a designed catalyst for what comes next. If that theory is correct, then the King in Yellow's activities have already changed the 41st millennium in the most literal and visible way possible. And Pandemonium would be the story of what happens in the aftermath of that change. The completion of a project that reshaped the galaxy as its precondition, working toward an endpoint that the Great Rift was only ever the prelude to. The wait for that answer has been years. It continues, but the wait is finite. Pandemonium will come, and when it does, what Abnet has been building across 3 trilogies and nearly a quarter-century of fiction will finally be visible in its entirety. Part 12. The Deep Themes. What the King in Yellow tells us about the 40,000 universe. Step back from the plot mechanics and the specific mysteries and look at what the King in Yellow, as a concept and as a narrative, says about the broader universe of Warhammer 40,000. Because the most enduring mysteries in any setting are not just entertaining puzzles, they are expressions of the setting's deepest themes, the questions it returns to because those questions are actually about something. The 41st millennium, as a setting, is built on a specific and genuinely grim premise. That good intentions, genuine devotion, and absolute loyalty can produce catastrophic outcomes when subjected to the pressure of sufficient time and sufficient scale. The Imperium was built by someone who wanted to save humanity, who had a rational and sophisticated plan for doing so, who sacrificed more than any human being should ever be asked to sacrifice in pursuit of that vision. And what was built is a totalitarian theocracy that crushes individual lives with complete sincerity, that maintains itself through cruelty, that has calcified around the original vision like bone around an injury, until the living tissue is no longer visible beneath the dead weight. The King in Yellow fits into this thematic space with perfect precision. If Valdor is the king, and if Valdor is genuinely trying to accomplish something for humanity's benefit, then the Inquisition's hunt is a tragedy of the highest order, the institution dedicated to protecting the Emperor's legacy, actively preventing the one man still working toward the Emperor's actual vision. Because that man's methods look, from inside an institution built on fear and control, indistinguishable from the things the institution exists to fight, the alternative. If Valdor has been changed by 10,000 years of isolation and accumulated knowledge into something that only believes it is serving the Emperor, is equally thematic. The most loyal man in history, driven beyond the limits of what any consciousness was built to sustain, becoming exactly what he was always fighting, while still calling it loyalty. The road to the darkest place, paved with the best intentions and the most genuine devotion. Both of these are true to Warhammer, but both ask the same question that the setting has always asked, just from different angles. What does righteousness look like when stretched across impossible scales of time and suffering? There is also the literary inheritance of the original Chambers material that continues to resonate through Abnet's handling. Chambers' King in Yellow was associated with forbidden knowledge, with the madness that comes from seeing too clearly, from encountering a truth that the normal human mind cannot accommodate without breaking. The characters in the original stories went mad because a play showed them too much reality. They could not contain what they had glimpsed. The Apollonian Spear does the same thing to Valdor, but on a 10,000-year schedule. Every kill, every truth extracted from an enemy's dying essence, every fragment of the warp's actual nature absorbed through the blade's unique function, all of it accumulating, building, assembling a portrait of the universe that no other consciousness possesses. The question is the same question Chambers was asking. What do you become when you have seen too much truth? When the container of ordinary human perception has been overfilled with knowledge that ordinary human perception was not designed to hold? The spy thriller framing of the Bequin series adds its own layer. In a story built on deception and misdirection, Yet, in a universe where the Alpha Legion defined an entire faction around the principle that nothing you know about them is reliable, the deepest mystery is never the one that appears on the surface. Every reveal carries within it the possibility of being itself a misdirection. Every answer is also a question. The King in Yellow operates at the exact intersection of too much is known and nothing is certain, and that intersection is where the most interesting stories live. But this is also why the mystery has sustained itself across so many years of fan engagement. It is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a question with implications, and the implications branch outward into every corner of the setting's deepest lore. The King in Yellow is not just a character. He is a lens, a way of looking at the 41st millennium that reveals structures and connections that are invisible from any other angle. Chapter closing. The Yellow Veil. We have traveled a long way together in this journey through one of the most complex and carefully constructed mysteries in all of Warhammer 40,000 fiction. From a short story collection published in the final decade of the 19th century, through the long evolution of cosmic horror mythology, through the founding of the Custodes in the fires of ancient terror's unification, the wars of the Great Crusade, the burning of Prospero, the siege that ended an age, through the quiet darkness of a figure walking out of a golden palace one night and speaking half an oath into the air, through a young woman in a strange city finding a book full of a name. What do we actually know, having come all this way? We know the King in Yellow is real, not myth, not inquisitorial paranoia, but an operating force in the 41st millennium, with resources and organization and goals that have drawn simultaneous opposition from the Inquisition of the Imperium, up multiple traitor legions and 5 Eldari craft worlds. Those enemies do not make sense together, unless what is being opposed is something that threatens the current power structures of every major faction simultaneously. We know the King has spent what appears to be millennia pursuing the Emperor's true name in the primordial language of Enuncia, building in secret a domain within the Eldari Webway that houses an army of winged space marines and cloned blanks and possibly custodians. He operating through or alongside one of the oldest and most decentralized heretical organizations in human history. We know a book, recovered at tremendous cost from within the King's domain, identified the first 2 words of his identity as Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the Emperor's Spear, the most loyal man in the history of the Imperium, who disappeared from the Imperial Palace 10,000 years ago, speaking half of an oath that meant his duty was not finished. We know the Apollonian Spear, the weapon given to Valdor by the Emperor himself, designed to reveal the truth of those it kills, has been accumulating knowledge across decades and possibly millennia of combat, building in its wielder a composite understanding of chaos and the warp and the actual nature of existence that no other being alive possesses. We know that Pandemonium is coming, and when it arrives, that the question of who the King in Yellow truly is and what he truly wants will finally receive an answer. Consider for a moment what 10,000 years of waiting actually looks like when you try to hold it in your mind. Not the number. Numbers that large become abstract quickly, lose their emotional weight, cease to function as things you can actually imagine. Think instead about scale in personal terms. The Roman Empire at its height, Augustus to Romulus Augustulus, who covered barely 5 centuries. The entire span of recorded human civilization, from the first written languages through the present day, sits within approximately 5,500 years. The gap between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the present day is roughly 1,500 years. The King in Yellow has been operating in the shadows for 6 times that length of time. He has watched civilizations rise and fall that the current Imperium does not remember. He has seen planets die and be recolonized, and die again. He has watched the Space Marine legions become chapters and the chapters fragment and fracture and forge new traditions around the fading memory of what they once were. He has watched the ecclesiarchy grow from nothing into a galaxy-spanning institution that the Emperor himself would have considered a profound betrayal of everything the Imperium was supposed to stand for. What he has watched Abaddon launch 13 Black Crusades, 13 times the despoiler he named in the moment of his near death, reached through the eye of terror and hammered at the gate, exactly as the Apollonian spear showed Valdor he would. Every single one of those Black Crusades, Valdor saw coming. The spear showed him. He watched each one approach across centuries, knowing what it was, knowing its outcome, unable to stop it without compromising whatever the larger project required. As that is the specific and particular horror of being what Valdor might have become. Not ignorance, not the mercy of not knowing, full and precise knowledge in advance of every defeat, every world burned, every hero killed, every generation ground down by a war that is not progressing toward victory because the war was never designed to be won, just survived. And he stayed anyway. He kept building. He kept waiting. Yet he kept faith with whatever the Emperor asked of him in those final moments before the golden throne closed around a broken body and a still burning mind. Whatever you think of the King in Yellow, whether you read him as savior or threat, as the most loyal servant in history, or as the ultimate cautionary tale about what isolation and terrible knowledge can do to even the most extraordinary consciousness, the sheer scale of the commitment is beyond ordinary admiration or condemnation. But he is something the 41st millennium did not expect and does not have a category for. A 10,000-year patience directed at a single purpose, by a being who has never forgotten what that purpose was, in a universe that tries very hard to make everyone forget everything. But whether that patience ends in salvation or catastrophe, whether the thing it produces is the restoration Valdor has been building toward, or something the universe has been holding its breath against, is the question that Pandemonium will answer. Whether that answer confirms what the evidence suggests, or contradicts it, or reveals something so much stranger than any theory that the community has considered, that all the theorizing looks quaint in retrospect. That is the specific pleasure of a mystery handled well. The wait for a resolution that genuinely earns everything that was built to lead to it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the most dangerous things are not always the ones with the loudest armies and the most visible gods on their side. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is the one who has been waiting, the one who has been preparing, the one who has been building something in the dark for 10,000 years, by a light that no one else can see, toward a purpose that the universe has been conspiring to make impossible, and who is still there, still working, still faithful to half an oath spoken at the door of a golden palace on a night that changed everything. The King in Yellow has been waiting. He has not finished waiting yet, but the patience of 10,000 years has to end somewhere. If this kind of deep lore exploration is what you come here for, the slow unraveling of the 41st millennium's most carefully hidden secrets, the stories within the stories that make the grimdark universe so much richer than it appears on the surface, then leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Drop your own theory about the King in Yellow in the comments below. This community has some of the sharpest minds in the entire fandom, and a mystery this deep deserves the best possible conversation. Who do you think the King in Yellow truly is? What do you think he actually wants? And when Pandemonium finally arrives, what do you expect it to change? The yellow sign is out there. Keep watching for it. As we have traveled a long way together in this journey, through one of the most complex and carefully constructed mysteries in all of Warhammer 40,000 fiction. From a short story collection published in the final decade of the 19th century, through the long evolution of cosmic horror mythology, through the founding of the Custodes in the fires of ancient terror's unification, the wars of the Great Crusade, the burning of Prospero, the siege that ended an age, or through the quiet darkness of a figure walking out of a golden palace one night and speaking half an oath into the air, through a young woman in a strange city finding a book full of a name. What do we actually know, having come all this way? We know the King in Yellow is real, not myth, not inquisitorial paranoia, but an operating force in the 41st millennium with resources and organization and goals that have drawn simultaneous opposition from the Inquisition of the Imperium, our multiple traitor legions, and 5 Eldari craft worlds. Those enemies do not make sense together unless what is being opposed is something that threatens the current power structures of every major faction simultaneously. We know the king has spent what appears to be millennia pursuing the emperor's true name in the primordial language of Enuncia, building in secret a domain within the Ildari Webway that houses an army of winged space marines and cloned blanks and possibly custodians, as operating through or alongside one of the oldest and most decentralized heretical organizations in human history. We know a book recovered at tremendous cost from within the king's domain identified the first 2 words of his identity as Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the Emperor's Spear, the most loyal man in the history of the Imperium, who disappeared from the imperial palace 10,000 years ago, speaking half of an oath that meant his duty was not finished. Well, we know the Apollonian Spear, the weapon given to Valdor by the Emperor himself, designed to reveal the truth of those it kills, has been accumulating knowledge across decades and possibly millennia of combat, building in its wielder a composite understanding of chaos and the warp, and the actual nature of existence that no other being alive possesses. We know that Pandemonium is coming, and when it arrives, the question of who the King in Yellow truly is and what he truly wants will finally receive an answer. Whether that answer confirms what the evidence suggests, or contradicts it, or reveals something so much stranger than any theory that the community has considered that all the theorizing looks quaint in retrospect. That is the specific pleasure of a mystery handled well. The wait for a resolution that genuinely earns everything that was built to lead to it. As in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the most dangerous things are not always the ones with the loudest armies and the most visible gods on their side. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is the one who has been waiting, the one who has been preparing, the one who has been building something in the dark for 10,000 years, by a light that no one else can see, toward a purpose that the universe has been conspiring to make impossible, and who is still there, was still working, still faithful to half an oath spoken at the door of a golden palace on a night that changed everything. The King in Yellow has been waiting. He is not finished waiting yet. But the patience of 10,000 years has to end somewhere. If this kind of deep lore exploration is what you come here for, the slow unraveling of the 41st millennium's most carefully hidden secrets, and ask the stories within the stories that make the grimdark universe so much richer than it appears on the surface, then leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Drop your own theory about the King in Yellow in the comments below. This community has some of the sharpest minds in the entire fandom, and a mystery this deep deserves the best possible conversation. Who do you think the King in Yellow truly is? What do you think he actually wants? And when Pandemonium finally arrives, what do you expect it to change? The yellow sign is out there. Keep watching for it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.